So the title announces the topic. And the topic is the meaning of fundamental mind. The Tibetan word for fundamental mind, nyuksem, sem, most commonly is translated as mind. I don't even know of other translations by people for it. And the word for that I translate as fundamental, some people translate as genuine. If you look it up in the dictionary, nyukma is translated by is described by a negative word as majeba, not made up, not fabricated. And it itself is not a negative term. You know, it's not something like not fabricated. So you can see why some people translate it as genuine. If it's not fabricated, then it must be genuine. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, uses the word innermost. If you take away all the coverings of conceptuality, things that are made up, if you take away all the clothing, he's never explained his translation, but you can imagine why he is. Well, I can speculate you see, in Geluk, I first heard him translate or use a translation term in the context of Geluk. And the fundamental innate mind of clear light is manifested by concentrating at various places within the body, and by concentrating on those places, one can stop the manifestation of the coarser levels of consciousness. So one is concentrating in a tiny, you see, innermost place, and thereby manifesting. This is manifesting something that is not perceived as being in a tiny place. You follow? It's not perceived then as being in a tiny place. Well, one concentrates in a tiny place in order to manifest something then that is not experienced as being in a tiny place. So you see, it is something that is innermost. So I don't know as I have heard him use the same term, but I imagine he would in the context of Nyingma. I assume he would. So genuine, you can see the relevance of Innermost. You can see why people use the term, why someone might use the term non-artificial, non-fabricated. I use fundamental, as in fundamental innate mind of clear light. When I bring up different translations, I'm not trying to convince people of the absolute rightness of the term that I use, but like to bring up various terms in order to get different, in order to appreciate the richness of these terms. And to appreciate the points of view from which different translators use different terms. I usually try, usually means I always try to find usages within spoken Tibetan also, and usages in different contexts. And it's very hard with this term, yukma, to find a usage in spoken Tibetan, colloquial Tibetan. Okay, clear light. Word for analysis is a typical term for analysis. The word for distinguishing is what I see is an older term, shenje, which means analysis or distinguishing. And Khetsun Sangpo is going to explain why we need to distinguish the basis, path, and fruit, great completenesses. You might think there would be only one great completeness or great perfections. But there's a basis, great completeness, a path, great completeness, and a fruit, great completeness. A lot of people use the term great perfection, but indeed this is not something. I use great completeness from, I should have thought this out beforehand. Who's the contemporary Nyingma Lama who's famous for his book on death and living?
Rinpoche.
Who?
Sogyal Rinpoche.
Sogyal Rinpoche. Yeah, I stole the term great completeness from him because it's something already complete. It doesn't need to be perfected or made complete. it's already complete. And I thought, oh, that's really good. And so I stole, so to speak. I'm just making a joke. I copied him. And great perfection can also be looked at that way too. And many people avoid translating it and just calling it Dzogchen. But Dzog means complete. I mean, that's probably its basic meaning. I don't know if its basic meaning is perfect myself. And of course, Chen means great, big. So there are three: basis, path, and fruit, and we've got to get them straight, as Khetsun Sangpo says. And in going over the title, I don't want to spend too much time because that would anticipate the whole book. And it'll brighten up our intelligence to get these straight. So Khetsun Sangpo's oral commentary is embedded in the translation, and I made a mistake in not pointing out that the bracketed material in the translation is his commentary also. It's not my commentary. It's his. So I'm from the school of slow reading. Probably take us a couple of centuries to get through this. With non-dual belief, belief is more like here devotion, respectful interest. In re-listening to his commentary, he says he glossed this word merba as respect, which means respectful interest. And I woke up this morning thinking avid, like devotional, respectful interest. You know, I'm intent on the ultimate great completeness. He's saying, I, Mipam Gyatsho, have, that's what devotion is. This word merba means many different things: imagination, devotion, interest, keenness. You get the idea. And what is this? You see this word fundamental is appearing genuine Vajra mind, but the fundamental Vajra mind. You can see how the word nyukma is working. It is the fundamental Vajra mind. And you're going to see how everything comes out of this. Primordially pure. It's uncompounded. It's not compounded. I think the one difference between how His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about Nyingma is that within this kind of teaching of Nyingma, the Vajra mind itself is, I think we'd have to say, truly uncompounded, permanent. Whereas His Holiness explains this kind of permanence as a continuum of the impermanent. So the continuum goes on forever, and in that sense is called permanent. It's just called permanent. But you'd have to say, in His Holiness's terms, is actually not a permanent mind. But I think we'll find enough terms that say it's blatantly uncompounded, simply uncompounded. And thus, it has to be actually permanent. But in every other respect, it's just the way His Holiness also describes it in the recent book that he published and I translated. So, basic element.
Jeffrey, can you give me a clue what permanent mind, meaning uncompounded mind, would be?
Oh, that's what the book's about. It's everything said here. Primordially pure, Vajra mind, fundamental. It's the element out of which everything shines forth. It's naturally luminous.
But what does it mean to be permanent?
It's not made by causes and conditions. That's what uncompounded means.
Then how
And
does it change and produce these things? Or are we samkhya?
it doesn't produce.
Ah,
And then, interestingly, in the next line, you see these things shine forth or dawn. The word is in Tibetan is shar, much as in Gelug, when you don't want to say that something which might seem to be produced from the permanent, you say it dawns. Much as in Gelug, the shifty term is it dawns, it shines forth. The same shifty footwork is used in Gelug. And then interesting in the next line is it really says it's the object, and there's no getting around. The word yul is used. It's the object of individual's self-knowledge, self-cognition, self-knowledge, self-cognition. And it pervades everything. Mundane existence. This is just a different word for cyclic existence. And peace, which Khetsun Sangpo glossed as nirvana. So in this new edition, I put nirvana in brackets. So this stanza is the an expression of worship the first is an expression of worship to Manjushri. So this Namo Guru Manjushri Jnana Satvaya, it's for the purpose, as he explains, but he added, which I didn't put originally in the translation, to a special deity, Manjushri, to remove interruptions. And for us listeners or readers, it's so that we can complete our task. You know, it's for the author to complete, in this case, his task of composition. And for us listeners or readers to complete our study over a couple hundred years of slow reading and slow listening. And I guess in my case, slow talking. And then Mi-pam-gya-tsho, after that expression of worship to Manjushri, he makes an expression of worship. He now makes a promise to compose the text, which is of 2 stanzas. And within the 2 stanzas, he does it first by indicating his devotion to the ultimate great completeness, in which he indicates the topic of his book. And then he makes a promise of composition. These are typical ways of commenting on the text. Typical ways of beginning a text. One is doesn't occur in all texts, but usually you indicate the contents within this type of expression, and then you promise to compose the text. I will do this. I will illuminate in the next stanza. And again, indicating the content. So I added at the end of the first indent something that Khetsun Sangpo said. Right after this expression of worship, he makes a promise to compose the work. So what Mipam-gyatsho has done is to gather together a whole lot of essential instructions, which, as he says, are easy practices, easier practices to make evident these profound meanings. Now, this uncompounded basic element is within our minds. And yesterday and today, Maybe that's why I slept so soundly and during my nap period. Khetsun Sangpo said that a victor has conquered in the battle of afflictions, in the battle with the afflictions. So that's why a victor is called a victor. And it's interesting that, to me, it's interesting that these, in talking about the children of a victor's body, speech, and mind, he begins with the children of a victor's speech are the hearers and solitary realizers. This indeed is what Chandrakirti says. And then when he turned to the child of, and you would have to say that he's talking about the open Buddha who openly displayed the 12 deeds in our era, the 12 deeds of a Buddha. This would be his own son. Now, I wondered today, did Shakyamuni Buddha have any children except Rahula?
There's no mention of any others.
Excuse me?
There's no mention of any others because he left the palace right after Rahula
Yeah,
was
so he had only one son?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, it's interesting that Khetsun Sangpo chose that avenue.
Yeah.
Chose that avenue to talk about, you could choose any Buddhas, any Buddha's bodily manifestations, but he chose that avenue to talk about the Buddha of our era. And so if he chooses that avenue, then there's only one Buddha of this era who openly displayed the 12 deeds, openly displayed. And that's Shakyamuni Buddha. And then the children of his mind, I have difficulty, bringing up the context for this. Of his mind are the bodhisattvas. But anyway, because Chandrakirti talks about the Buddhas being born from bodhisattvas. So then the context doesn't come out of Chandrakirti, the context for this. And he doesn't explain. So anyway, so I don't get the context. But anyway. And then he went line by line through the above material, and I didn't translate something that I spent quite a bit of time on this morning. And he said, what abides in the noumenon, the final reality of the minds of all born beings? Self-arisen, spontaneously established, pristine wisdom abides there. It took me a lot of time to keep pausing the machine, and I have a good way of pausing and going back and re-listening. So in other words, what's inside everybody's mind as its final reality? self-arisen, spontaneously established, pristine wisdom is inside everybody's mind. Self-arisen, or in other words, naturally arisen, spontaneously established, pristine wisdom is inside everybody's mind. So you can see His Holiness's usage of innermost. Innermost wisdom is inside there. And then he turned to this term that's up above, where Mipam-gyatsho says, I will illuminate here in accordance with the transmission of quintessential instructions the meaning of the supreme secret treasury of the standpoint. Now, I searched around a lot for a term. Tsongkhapa says the word gongba is honorific for samba. Samba is just thought or thinking. And scholars often translate this term gongba as intention. I don't. Intention could mean purpose. And there's another word for purpose. So if the word gongba is just honorific for thought or thinking, then we could translate it as thought or thinking. But in that line, I wanted to come up with a different word. So I translated it up there as standpoint or perspective. Or even I wanted to translate it as deep structure. Only once in this book. I don't usually go to different terms. Now, the standpoint or perspective of self-subsistent, self-abiding, pristine wisdom. The perspective of self-subsistent, pristine wisdom. Now, Khetsun Sangpo himself said that this term is the honorific of mind. Sem. It's just the honorific for mind. So exalted mind, or if we want to call it exalted standpoint, is the honorific of mind. The exalted standpoint or exalted perspective abiding there inside your mind is like a supreme secret treasury of the victors of the past, present, and future. Inside your mind is a supreme secret treasury of the Buddhas of the past, present, and future. Inside your mind is a treasury. A little bit different words in Tibetan for treasure and treasury. You know, there's a big treasury of the Buddhas of the past, present, and future. So the exalted perspective abiding inside your mind is like a supreme secret vault, or, if you go inside a bank and there's a huge, what do we call it? Is it called a vault?
Yeah.
Vault. You see, this is the naturally abiding one, the basic one, the fundamental one, inside your own mind. And then Khetsun Sangpo said, the author, Mipam Gyatsho, will illuminate this here by way of the unbroken transmission of quintessential instructions. What are these quintessential instructions? They are easier practices. It's very interesting. He used the word easier. That doesn't mean they're easy. They're easier than something. Easier practices of the path, gathered together from holy beings. These are holy beings, unbroken transmission. They're holy, excellent, right, of the past, and these have been passed down. And so he gathered these together, and this is what I'm promising to explain to you. Pretty cool. And one of the wonderful things about this book is that he didn't write this down. One of his students, oh my gosh, Seichen, I forgot. Anyway, Seichen Gyatsho wrote it down. These poor people, like translators and so forth, they get totally forgotten. It's like when I work hard to put together a book of His Holiness's teachings, my name ends up in tiny print, and His Holiness is in huge. That's fine. You get forgotten. Khetsun Sangpo wrote them down. And when that happens, you get a far richer account than you would if the author went through it, because the author would give a very parsimonious, the author would eliminate a lot of the repetition and so forth. So you get a much richer account when somebody else takes notes, and you get a far more expansive account. Now, what I did above when I used the word, now it's standpoint or perspective, I put in the word gongba just to alert people who know Tibetan. And then down in the next line here, I put the final destination, that is the exalted thought. And I put gongba in again to alert the reader that this is now just the honorific translation for exalted thought. I put in the word gongba again. I think that the reason why people use the word intention is that it gives the word, rather than the word thought, a more uplifting sense of the word rather than thought. But I think one can mistake the word intention for purpose. And thus I do not use the word intention. Because, you say, my intention was to help you. My purpose was to help you. What I wanted to do was to help you. My wish was to help you. And there's a very important word in Tibetan interpretation. You have to have a different word for thought and what the Buddha's thought was and what the Buddha's word purpose was. So I won't use the word intention. However, the problem with the word thought is we also use it for conceptual thought. So when I want it to be conceptual thought, I try to use the word conceptuality or conceptual thought. This is not conceptual thought. This is non-conceptual thought.
How can you have not? I've always wanted translators say conceptual thought because my understanding is thought is always conceptual.
Yeah, and it isn't. Now you know.
So what does thought mean if it doesn't mean conceptual? It means
non-conceptual thought. But you see, a Buddha knows something. And what is a Buddha thinking of when a Buddha says there's no external world? The Buddha's thinking there is external world.
But that their intention is much better than thought.
Really?
Yeah.
I always answer with things like, really? And then he understands immediately what I mean by really. You see what my thought is. See, now I'm claiming Buddhahood. You understand that I'm not Buddhahood. So, this is, unfortunately, I'd explain, this is what I usually say. The lot I could explain, but the time's up.